My name is Raina Hutchins, and I'm 32 years old. 3 years ago, my mother-in-law stood in my kitchen and told me I would regret the day I said no to her. She was right. I did regret it, just not the way she meant. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and I was in Portland, Oregon. In the house my husband Wes and I had bought 2 years into our marriage. A small blue Craftsman with a crooked porch light and a mortgage I'd fought hard to qualify for on my own income before Wes and I even met. That detail matters. Remember it. The knock came at 7:40 p.m. No, because I'd just put a lasagna in the oven and glanced at the clock, annoyed at the interruption. It was Wes's mother, Carol Hutchins, and behind her, his sister Denise, both dressed like they were attending something formal instead of ambushing me on a weeknight. Carol didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past me into the living room, sat down on my couch, and said the sentence that would define the next 3 years of my life. "We need you to sell this house." I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought it was a joke, or I'd misheard her. She didn't laugh back. Denise explained it like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed in the car. Their father, Wes's father Gary, had defaulted on a business loan. The bank was circling. Without a fast injection of cash, they'd lose the family hardware store that had been open since 1978, 42 years. Carol's voice cracked exactly on cue when she said that number. And then Carol looked at me, nodded her son at me, and said the house I'd built my credit for, painted every room of myself, was just a house. And that family was supposed to come before bricks. Wes said nothing. He sat beside me on our own couch and said absolutely nothing while his mother asked me to hand over my home. I said no. Carol stood up so fast her purse fell off her lap. She looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd stepped in, and she said, "You are a cold-hearted woman. Raina, I hope you can live with what you've done to this family." She was almost out my front door when she turned around one last time and said something quieter, something I wasn't meant to fully hear. She has no idea what's actually in that house. I didn't understand what she meant that night. It would take me 2 years, 1 funeral, and a locked drawer in my own attic to find out. Here is what you should know about me before I go further, because my mother-in-law certainly never bothered to learn it. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the only child of a single mother who cleaned offices at night and slept during the day. I put myself through community college working at a diner, transferred to a state university on loans I'm still paying off, and became a claims adjuster for an insurance firm downtown. I read contracts for a living. I catch the sentence everyone else skims past. That skill would matter more than anyone in the Hutchins family ever imagined. I met Wes at a coworker's barbecue. He was easy and warm, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after one conversation. I fell for him slowly, the way you fall for someone who makes ordinary evenings feel worth having. We married 18 months later in a backyard ceremony with 40 guests, and I genuinely believed I was marrying into a family, not just a man. Carol was polite to me at first, in the careful, appraising way some mothers are with their sons' wives. It took maybe 4 months of marriage before I understood the politeness had a price tag. Wes's father, Gary, ran Hutchins Hardware on the same corner it had occupied since before Wes was born. It was failing long before that October night, though nobody said so out loud. I'd heard fragments over holiday dinners. A bad inventory system. A loan Gary had taken against the store to cover Denise's divorce lawyer 2 years earlier. Nobody in that family discussed money directly. They discussed obligation instead. And obligation was always somehow mine to carry, never theirs to explain. After Carol left my house that night, Wes finally spoke. He said his mother was under stress, that I shouldn't take it personally, that maybe we could look into a home equity line, just to help a little, just enough to buy them time. I told him no meant no for both of us, and he nodded like he agreed. I didn't yet know that nodding was the only thing Wes was ever going to do in this fight. The calls started the next week. Not to me, to Wes, at hours he thought I couldn't hear. I'd catch pieces through the bathroom door, Gary's voice low and pleading. Then Carol's, sharper, always circling back to the same phrase. "Your wife owes this family." I owed them nothing. I had never once asked the Hutchins family for anything. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at my house, addressed not to me and not to Wes. It was addressed to my late father, a man who, as far as I knew, had died before I turned 2 years old, and who I had never once mentioned to Carol Hutchins in my life. I stood in my driveway holding that envelope for a full minute before I went back inside. The return address was a law office in Tacoma, Washington. My father's name, Marcus Doyle, was printed on the front in official type, followed by C.O. Raina Hutchins, which meant whoever sent it knew exactly where to find me. I had never used the name Doyle. I hadn't spoken it aloud in over a decade. My mother had raised me to think of him as a closed door, a man who left before I could form a single memory of his face. I opened it standing in my own kitchen with the lasagna dish still in the sink. It was a notice from an estate attorney. Marcus Doyle had died 8 months earlier in a town called Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 2 hours from where I grew up, and I had never known he lived. He'd left behind a property. The letter didn't specify what kind, only that as his sole living heir, I needed to contact the office regarding disposition of assets, and that a deadline existed for me to respond before the estate defaulted to the state. I called my mother that night. She went quiet in a way that told me everything before she said a word. She admitted finally, after 30 years, that my father hadn't simply vanished. He'd left because of the inheritance dispute of his own, something involving his late brother and a piece of land nobody in that side of the family wanted attached to their name. She said she'd cut all contact on purpose, to protect me from whatever mess came with the Doyle name. I asked her the only question that mattered. Had she ever mentioned my father to Carol Hutchins? She said no. Not once, not ever. Which meant Carol had gone looking. Which meant Carol knew something about my father, and by extension about me, that I did not know myself. I thought about her voice on the porch that night, quiet enough that she thought I hadn't caught it. She has no idea what's actually in that house. I had assumed she meant my house, the craftsman on the crooked porch. I was wrong. She hadn't been talking about my house at all. I sat at my kitchen table until midnight with that attorney's letter in front of me, and for the first time since Carol, Hutchins walked into my living room and called me cold-hearted. I understood something with total clarity. She hadn't come to my house that October night because she needed my help. She'd come because she already knew what I was sitting on, and she wanted it before I ever found out it was mine. I called the attorney's office the next morning before my shift started. The lawyer's name was Ellis Whitfield, an older man with a slow, deliberate voice who sounded like he'd been waiting for this call longer than 8 months. He confirmed that Marcus Doyle, my father, had died of a heart condition alone, in a rented house outside Coeur d'Alene. No wife, no other children. I was, in the eyes of the law, the only person left standing. Then he told me what the property actually was. Not a house. 14 acres of undeveloped land on the edge of a lake town called Harmon's Bluff, purchased by my father 11 years earlier, back when the land was worth little more than the taxes on it, except a resort development company had spent the last 2 years quietly buying up every parcel along that shoreline. And Ellis said my father had been in the middle of negotiating a sale before he died. A sale worth, by his conservative estimate, somewhere near $900,000. I had to sit down on my kitchen floor. I asked him the question that had been circling my chest since the letter arrived. Had anyone else contacted his office asking about the estate? There was a pause. Then he said yes. A woman had called 3 separate times over the past 2 months, identifying herself as a family friend trying to help locate the rightful heir. She'd asked detailed questions about the property's value and the sale timeline. She'd left a callback number. He read it to me. I didn't need to write it down. I already knew it by heart. It was Carol Hutchins' cell phone. I sat there on my kitchen tile, understanding finally what I hadn't let myself understand the whole time. Carol hadn't found out about my father by accident. Somewhere, somehow, she had learned about Marcus Doyle's land before I ever knew he existed to me. And she had spent months circling it like a woman waiting for a door to open, hoping I would either never find out or find out too late to matter. The hardware store crisis, the desperate visit to my living room, the insistence that I sell my house immediately before anything else could surface. It had never been about Gary's failing business at all. It had been a distraction. A hand waved in front of my face while another hand reached towards something worth 9 times what my little blue craftsman was worth. I thought about Wes sitting silently on our couch that night, nodding along with his mother. I needed to know urgently whether my husband had known any of this. I found the answer in his email account 2 nights later, and it broke something in me that never fully went back together. I want to explain how I ended up in Wes's email, because I'm not a woman who goes digging through her husband's accounts. I found it by accident, the way most betrayals are found. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter for a video call with his mother that he'd forgotten to close, and my own name in the subject line of an old message caught my eye before I could look away. The email was 7 months old. Sent from Carol to Wes, with the subject line, Raina's father, do not mention to her yet. I read every message in that thread standing barefoot on my kitchen floor. and I read them twice. Carol had learned about Marcus, Doyle's land, through a cousin who worked title searches in Idaho, a distant relative who recognized the Doyle name on a filing and mentioned it at a family gathering months before that. October night, Carol had done the math immediately. Her son's wife was the daughter of a man sitting on lakefront, property about to be worth a fortune, and that man was dying. She hadn't told me. She'd told Wes instead, and asked him to keep it from me until she could find a way to. In her own words, make sure the money benefits the whole family, not just Raina's side of things. Wes had agreed. Not once in that thread did my husband push back. Not once did he write, "She deserves to know this is her father." Instead, he wrote, "Whatever you think is best, Mom. I trust your judgment." He had known about my father's death before I did. He had known about $900,000 in lakefront land before I did, and he had sat beside me on our couch that same month, silently watching his mother demand I sell my own house, knowing full well there was a fortune waiting behind, a door I hadn't even found yet. The hardware store debt was real, I'd later confirm, but it had never been urgent enough to justify Carol's panic that night. The panic was never about Gary's shop. It was about time. Carol needed my house sold, needed me financially entangled with the family, before the Idaho estate resolved itself and I inherited something. Wes's mother had already decided, without asking me once, belonged to all of them. I closed the laptop and stood very still in my kitchen for a long time. When Wes came home that evening, kissed my cheek like nothing in the world was wrong, and asked what smelled good on the stove, I looked at my husband of 2 years and asked him one simple question in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it was. "How long have you known about my father, Wes?" His face went the color of the wall behind him. He didn't lie. I'll give him that much, even now. Wes set his keys down on the counter like they suddenly weighed too much, and he told me everything, standing in the kitchen while the stove ticked as it cooled. 7 months. He'd known for 7 months. He said he'd wanted to tell me a dozen times, that he'd started the sentence in his head every night before bed and lost his nerve every single time, because his mother had convinced him that telling me too early would mean I'd cut them out completely. The moment the money became real, I asked him the only question that mattered. Did you ever even once think this was my father, my inheritance, my decision to make? He didn't answer that one. He looked at the floor instead, which was answer enough. I didn't scream. I want you to understand that, because I know what you might be picturing. I've spent 10 years reading insurance claims, calming down strangers who've just lost their homes to fire or flood, people whose whole lives collapsed in one afternoon. I know how to go quiet when quiet serves me better than noise. I went upstairs, packed a bag for 3 days, and told Wes I needed space to think, which was true, and that I would be at a hotel, which was not. I drove 2 hours to Coeur d'Alene that night instead. I sat in Ellis Whitfield's office the next morning and told him everything. The calls from Carol, the email thread, the timeline that no longer looked like coincidence to either of us. He listened with the careful stillness of a man who'd seen families do worse over far less. Then he told me something that changed the entire shape of what came next. My father, in the 8 months before he died, had not simply drafted a will naming me as heir and left it at that. He'd left a letter with the estate file, sealed, addressed to me by name, with instructions that it only be opened once. I'd formally accepted the inheritance in person. Nobody, not Carol, not her cousin in title searches, not even Ellis himself, had read what was inside it. I sat in that office with my father's handwriting waiting behind a sealed flap, a man I had no memory of, who had apparently thought of me enough in his final months to leave written words no one else was allowed to see first. My hands were shaking when Ellis slid the envelope across his desk and told me it was mine to open whenever I was ready. I wasn't ready, but I opened it anyway. And the first line inside that letter told me my mother-in-law's greed was the smallest part of what I was about to discover. The letter began, "Raina, if you're reading this, I ran out of time to say this to your face, and that's the one regret I'm taking with me." My father wrote that he'd spent years staying away deliberately, not out of indifference, but because of a promise he'd made my mother when I was a baby. After a dispute over his brother's estate, turned violent enough that he feared what proximity to that side of the family could cost me. He'd watched from a distance instead. He knew my nursing home volunteer work in college. He knew the name of the insurance firm I worked for. He'd driven past my wedding venue in Portland and sat in his car in the parking lot, too afraid to walk in and disrupt a day that wasn't his to disrupt. And then came the part that changed everything. He wrote that roughly a year before he died, a woman had contacted him directly. Not me. Him. She'd introduced herself as his son-in-law's mother. Said she was reaching out on behalf of the family to reconnect him with his daughter, and asked detailed questions about his health, his assets, and whether he'd made arrangements for the Harmon's Bluff land. He'd been suspicious enough not to give her anything specific, but he'd been lonely enough and sick enough to keep talking to her for months, believing she was building a bridge back to a daughter. He'd never had the courage to contact himself. He'd written down her name in the letter, so there would be no confusion about who she was. Carol Hutchins had spoken to my father while he was dying for nearly a year, using my name as a doorway into his trust, all while telling her own son to keep me in the dark. She had tried to get to my father's assets before I ever knew he was alive, let alone dying. And when that door quietly closed with his death, she had simply pivoted to my house instead, hoping to secure something, anything, before the estate resolved and the truth came out. My father's letter ended with one line I've read more times than I can count since. I don't know what kind of family you married into, Raina, but I know you're stronger than the daughter. I imagined all those years I stayed away. Don't let anyone tell you what's owed and to whom. You get to decide that now. I sat in Ellis Whitfield's office with that letter in my lap, and felt something settle in my chest that had been loose for 3 weeks. I knew exactly what I was going to do next, and it would not involve raising my voice even once. I didn't confront Carol at her kitchen table. The way she'd once confronted me at mine, I chose better ground. I asked Ellis to help me draft one document before anything else happened. A formal record of every call Carol had made to his office, cross-referenced with the emails from Wes's laptop and a signed statement from my father's letter, notarized as part of the estate file. Then I did something Carol never once considered I was capable of. I called a family meeting myself at Hutchins Hardware on a Sunday afternoon when the store was closed and Gary would be there doing inventory, the one place Carol couldn't control the room. Gary looked exhausted when I walked in, a man aged 10 years by debt he hadn't caused and hadn't caused. I laid the papers on his workbench one by one and let him read them in silence while Carol stood by the register, her face losing color with every page he turned. I told Gary the truth, plainly, without drama. His wife had spent nearly a year manipulating a dying man she'd never met, hoping to secure money that was never hers to secure, while telling her son to lie to his own wife by omission. I told him the hardware store's debt was real, and that I was willing to help him personally, not the family him, with a loan at fair terms, repayable, because he had never once been part of the scheme. Then I turned to Carol and said the only thing I'd come to say. You called me cold-hearted for protecting one house. I want you to sit with what you did trying to take two. She didn't cry the way she had on my porch 3 years earlier. There was no performance left in her, because for the first time, no one in the room was buying the show. I filed for divorce from Wes 2 weeks later. He didn't fight it, and honestly, some quiet part of me wished he had, just to prove there'd been something worth fighting for. There wasn't. I sold the Harmon's Bluff land 8 months after that, at fair market value to a buyer of my choosing, not the resort company Carol had been circling. I used part of it to pay off my craftsman entirely, the little blue house with the crooked porch light that started this whole story, the one thing I'd built without asking anyone's permission. I used the rest to start a small trust in my father's name, funding scholarships for kids aging out of foster care in Idaho, the closest thing to family he'd had at the end. I still live in that house. The porch light finally got fixed, and every time I unlock my own front door, I remember exactly who tried to take it from me, and exactly whose name is on the deed now. Mine, only mine, and it always will be.